Today we're going to look at a process called photosynthesis. And basically photosynthesis is a two-stage process in which the sun's energy excites electrons, and then those electrons are carried to a new stage called the Calvin cycle, where carbon is fixed into larger, more complex molecules of carbon. First pyruvic acid, and then the pyruvate or pyruvic acid combine together to form glucose, cellulose, or starch. The general equation for photosynthesis is carbon dioxide plus water with the presence of light forms a sugar plus oxygen. And it's important to note here that oxygen is simply a byproduct. It's something that the plant wants to get rid of and does not need. And it's a good thing because as the oxygen leaves the stomata, that oxygen will then be used by some forms of, well, obviously animals, but also different types of bacteria as well. This is a picture of a chloroplast, which is a location in which photosynthesis takes place. And the basic structure of the chloroplast is there's two different membranes, and then there's these stacks called granum. These discs, each individual disc is called a thylakoid, and they stack together, and they're surrounded by a fluid called the stroma. And so these different processes that we're going to be talking about today are happening within these stacks or in these membranes, and then also within the stroma. But everything takes place in these organelles called the chloroplasts. In order to understand photosynthesis, we need to look at these 6 different terms that you'll need to be familiar with. The first one being the stomata. The stomata are openings in leaves that allow for carbon dioxide and oxygen and water to move into and out of the plant. Carbon dioxide needs to be brought in for this process, and oxygen needs to be brought out for this process. And then also water actually has the ability in some plants to move into the plant through the stomata, and then also to leave the plant through the stomata. And the plant has the ability to control whether or not the stomata are open. So for example, if the plant were in a crisis where it was experiencing a drought, maybe the stomata could stay closed to prevent evaporation from occurring, and then the plant would be able to maintain or to keep its current water levels and reduce the amount of water it's losing. The chloroplasts are the organelles. I just showed you a picture of the chloroplast. This is where photosynthesis actually takes place. And the chloroplasts are most highly concentrated in the leaves of the plant. Now the chloroplasts can be found in very small numbers in other parts of the plant, but they're most highly concentrated in leaves, especially in the portion of the leaf that is facing the sunlight. And really, with its function, it makes a lot of sense why there'd be so many chloroplasts here. Now within the chloroplast we also have a structure called the thylakoid, and I showed you a picture of the thylakoid on the previous slide. And if we look at the thylakoid here, these are these discs that stack up and form what we call the granum. And the thylakoids are where the chlorophyll can be found, or the green pigmentation that is responsible for absorbing the sunlight and transforming that sunlight energy into a form that the plant can use to produce glucose, cellulose, or starch. Also, they have the carotenoids. These are the orange and yellow pigments that absorb light energy, and these can be found in higher concentrations in some plants over other plants. And then finally you have the stroma, which is the fluid that exists between the thylakoid stacks and the chloroplasts. And this is where we can see, this is where the Calvin cycle or the light-independent reactions take place. Photosynthesis can be broken down into 2 different stages, the light reactions and the dark reactions, or the light-independent reactions. And we'll also refer to that as the Calvin cycle, named after the individual who's responsible for first observing this process taking place. Here we have a diagram that's showing the overall 2 stages of photosynthesis. And what we're basically showing here is we're showing that there are 3 inputs: light, water, and carbon dioxide. Light and water are important for the light reactions to take place properly. The light is responsible for exciting electrons, and then those excited electrons can get carried by a molecule that we call NADPH. And then also ATP is responsible for carrying energy to help fuel the Calvin cycle, so the Calvin cycle can take place without the presence of light. As you can also see, NADPH, which is also known as an electron carrier, will then give up its electron, and then it gets recycled back into the light reaction, so the light reaction can do its thing. So this light reaction is taking place in the thylakoid, and then the Calvin cycle is taking place in the fluid outside of the thylakoid called the stroma. And so basically NADPH and ATP are being cycled from the thylakoids to the stroma back to the thylakoid, and then that cycle will continue over and over again. So these molecules will just be recycled within the chloroplast. In addition to light, water is also necessary for the light reactions, and that's because water is going to provide electrons, water is going to provide hydrogen ions, and water is also going to provide oxygen, which is where this output of O2 comes from. So without water, this plant will not have electrons to excite, NADPH will not have the electrons to carry to the Calvin cycle, and then oxygen will not be outputted. So water is absolutely necessary for photosynthesis to take place. The second stage of photosynthesis is called the Calvin cycle, and in order for the Calvin cycle to take place correctly, carbon dioxide must be present. Carbon dioxide must be present because carbon dioxide obviously contains the atom carbon, and it's carbon that will be fixed in this process to form what we call pyruvate, pGal, or pyruvic acid. And these pGals will be combined together to form sugar. pGal is a molecule that contains 3 carbon atoms, and when 2 3-carbon atoms molecules come together, we get a 6-carbon molecule, also known as sugar. The summary of the light reactions is here in these 5 bullet points. And basically, light reactions, as I said previously, take place in the thylakoid membranes. It is chlorophyll A and B, which is responsible for absorbing the sunlight, and it absorbs blue and red wavelengths, and it reflects, you got it, green wavelengths, which gives it its green color. It involves 2 different photosystems, photosystems 1 and 2. And these are large molecules that are found within the thylakoid membranes. It splits water into electrons, protons, and oxygen, as I stated previously. And then the products are ATP and then an electron carrier that we call NADPH. And these are the 2 energy sources that will be used to drive the dark reactions. The summary of the dark reactions, or the light-independent reactions, it takes place in the stroma, or the fluid that exists outside the thylakoid membranes. It uses energy that was stored in the light reactions to reduce or add electrons and hydrogens to carbon dioxide, and this is called carbon fixing. And in essence, what it does is it ends up turning carbon dioxide into organic molecules. These are 3 carbon sugars that we refer to as pGal, pyruvate, or pyruvic acid. When these 3 carbon sugars come together, they pair up, they form 6 carbon molecules that we call glucose, cellulose, or starch. And this is just another image that I found on the internet that just basically shows some of the different inputs, such as water and sunlight, into the light reactions, and oxygen given off as a byproduct, ATP entering the Calvin cycle, NADPH entering the Calvin cycle. And within this, you can see that there is a cycle of ATP to ADP, there is a cycle of NADPH to NADP plus. Also, we have carbon dioxide as an input to the Calvin cycle, and then CH2O as an output from the Calvin cycle. So basically, a good starting point to understanding this process is to remember what the inputs are in each one of these stages in the light reactions in the Calvin cycle, and what the outputs are in each one of these stages, and what is happening with the carbon atoms. The carbon atoms are coming in the Calvin cycle, and they are combining together, and they are forming p-gal, and then the p-gals are combining together to form sugars. And in essence, that is a good summary of photosynthesis and what you'll be required to know for the test. Next, we'll be talking about